Well, I made it through graduation. It's all done. And now it's time to focus on some weather. And we actually have some severe weather to talk about that we need to focus on for Sunday. Now, here's just a little synopsis of what's going on at our upper levels. Essentially, we've got this trough that's going to be moving into our region going into the day on Sunday. And as it does so, it's going to pin just a little bit in through our region. And what that's going to do is increase some of these mid-level winds, particularly across eastern parts of South Dakota going down into Nebraska as we get later into the afternoon. Obviously, that's not all we need for severe weather, but that's kind of the first thing we kind of take a look at is to see how those mid-level winds are doing. And we do get an increase into the afternoon and evening hours. So that's kind of step one. Now, as we go a little bit lower into the atmosphere, not quite to the surface, but just a few thousand feet above, we see this southern jet stream that kind of sets up through the overnight hours here Saturday night into early Sunday morning. That's going to help transport some of that moisture into the region. Again, particularly across eastern South Dakota, southeast North Dakota, and eventually into parts of Minnesota. Now, I'm just going to take a stop and look here. Now, notice here we got this low-level jet stream early in the morning on Sunday. Now, a lot of times when these low-level jets set up through the overnight hours in early parts of the morning, just to the north of that is where some storms like to develop. So we may have storms already developing across parts of South Dakota as we get into the morning hours. Now, just kind of following that along through the afternoon and evening, you can see how that low-level jet pushes a little bit eastward and then also increases as it goes into Minnesota. So we're going to be looking at some storms developing, and it's going to try to move in this area that's a little more favorable for some shear. And in fact, as we go through the overnight hours, Sunday night and into Monday, we could see that low-level jet kind of continues across parts of Minnesota and even down into Iowa. So that might also help some of these storms linger late into the night and continue, I should say, to push south and eastward through the late night hours. And now we make our way down to the surface level. And of course, we have plenty of moisture being drawn up by these southerly winds. And look at this model. This is the European model, and kind of what I was talking about in this eastern part of South Dakota. This is right around 6-7 a.m. Sunday morning, early Sunday morning. Some storms may develop. And again, that potential already of seeing some hail with these storms is there. How good? Not as good as later in the afternoon, but just something to be aware of as we get into the morning hours on Sunday. All right, by the morning hours around 6-7 a.m., you can see where some of those higher dew points begin to nose into southern parts of South Dakota and just kind of not quite into Minnesota yet, but nevertheless, again, here's kind of where we've got that potential for seeing some storms early in the morning. But one other thing to note is we do have a warm front that kind of drapes a little bit further to the north, kind of something like that. And what we're looking at as we take a look at some of the winds, you can notice the winds are kind of coming out of the south, and then they kink and go a little more southeasterly. Same here, kind of south, and then they kink for a little bit out of the southeast. And that's kind of where our warm frontal boundary is. And as some of this air comes up and over this warm front, has potential for setting off some showers and storms north of that front in the morning as well. So while we may have some storms down here, we've got the potential at least of seeing some scattered early morning activity further to the north. Now, as we get closer to that noon time frame, look at how that moist air just surged to the north and made its way into North Dakota around noon. That warm frontal boundary sitting something like that at this point. And then behind it, we have this cold front, this trailing cold front. And the two together as we get later in the afternoon is really going to be the focus of where the severe weather is expected to take place. And so here we are right around 4 or 5 p.m. Again, that warm frontal boundary, kind of something in that area. The cold front sitting back and through here. We have all that moisture sitting just to the east of the cold front and south of the warm front. All this moisture and instability sitting within this area here. And it's a matter of what's going to happen north of the warm front before this cold front sweeps through and sets off additional storms. And so ultimately, as we get into the afternoon hours, it just depends on how everything plays out. But this area in here is going to be the concern, at least, for tornadic activity, at least in the early going. But now out of this comes a couple of different scenarios on how exactly this could play out. We're going to take a look at scenario 1. And we're looking at the morning hours, the earlier morning hours of Sunday. Again, we've got that potential for seeing maybe a few storms in through here, through the morning hours. And again, a little bit further north of that warm front, some storms possibly developing in the morning hours. Now, this stuff further to the north, not quite as unstable. So again, we're not really as concerned about some of these northern storms being severe. Perhaps some lightning you might see out of this, but the stuff further to the south, you might have a little better chance of 1 or 2 of these storms just reaching that severe level with some larger hail of 1 inch in diameter. As we go through the morning and get into the afternoon hours, again, we continue to see these storms further to the north, perhaps increasing in intensity, particularly across the Devil's Lake Basin, a little bit further back, closer to the Missouri River. And if some of these cells are able to remain discrete enough and not congeal into a line, we've got that possibility early on already where if they're able to remain by themselves, they've got the potential for, maybe seeing some rotation in, perhaps seeing a tornado or 2 out of a couple of these storms as they begin to develop into the afternoon hours. Now, as we get a little bit later and some more storms begin to develop, again, we get kind of some of these storms developing just north of the warm front, and then more begin to develop along the trailing cold front further back to the south and west. And eventually all these storms are going to kind of line up and congeal and begin to move into Minnesota. Now, by this point, we're right around 5, 6, 7 p.m. by the time these storms really get going. And you can see how this particular model gets a pretty decent line rolling through Lakes country. And I wouldn't be surprised if that line kind of continues a little bit further south and moves across portions of Huron and Watertown and perhaps just north or including Sioux Falls as well. 9, 10, and 11 p.m. And again, don't let this gap in between here fool you. I wouldn't be surprised if we get some storms developing or filling in on either side of this. So even though this particular model doesn't show it, we've got that potential for seeing some storms developing as it moves through eastern and southeastern parts of South Dakota. Now, scenario 2 becomes that these storms don't really have time to be discrete enough across that James River Valley area, southeastern parts of North Dakota, back into perhaps even Aberdeen. Again, that's kind of the area of focus, at least for the potential for seeing or a tornadic type activity as we get into the afternoon hours. Now, if this just develops into a line quickly, what we're going to be looking at more so is going to be some damaging winds, the line of storms that develop and just becomes that line of strong damaging winds where we're looking at 60, 70 mile per hour wind gusts associated with these storms. Now, within that, sometimes within the leading edge of these storms, you can get some brief tornadic spin up. So the chance is not zero. It does not diminish to zero if this scenario does play out, but it does become more of a wind threat if it congeals quicker and just becomes a line, and it becomes more of a wind threat if it does not remain discrete. So backing up and just giving a little bit of timing, this is 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 p.m., midnight, 1, 2, 3, 4 a.m. So you can see how those storms kind of track across the region, across our area, going into the afternoon and nighttime hours. Again, basically from west central parts of Minnesota down into South Dakota and all the way down across Nebraska is where we're expecting these storms to develop. So here's kind of what to watch out for. Again, maybe a discrete storm or 2 early in the morning that could have a little bit of hail associated with it across southeast parts of South Dakota. Now, as we get closer to noon time frame, there might be a storm or 2 already across the Missouri River that has some hail or some damaging winds associated with it. that might get going early enough to have some severe weather associated with it. But once we get to about 2, 3, 4 p.m., we're going to have to kind of keep an eye on from, we'll say Devil's Lake, kind of over to Steele, Jamestown, Valley City. We're going to kind of include that Aberdeen, maybe Watertown, Sisseton, up through Wahpeton, Fargo-ish area, kind of right in through that region. That's kind of the area of concern as we go into the afternoon hours for the possibility, again, of seeing a tornado or two associated with these storms. Now, as we get a little bit later and we get to about 6, 7 p.m., I think we're going to develop this line. So we're going to be moving from a large hail and tornadic threat to more of a wind damage threat. But again, we can't rule out the brief little spin-ups that can happen along the leading edge of some of these storms when these lines develop. So this is 7, 8, and 9 p.m. and I would expect kind of that line to be in through that region. And we'll kind of switch over to another model here that shows a little bit better of that location of where that line of storms could develop. This is 10, 11, midnight, 1 a.m., 2 a.m., 3 a.m. Now again, notice, remember I said how that low-level jet kind of sets up across to Minnesota going into Sunday night and early Monday morning. And of course, that's kind of where these storms want to track through the overnight hours. So it's possible that these storms do hold on and we get a little bit of wind damage or some stronger winds, at least associated with it, through the late night hours. So that might have been a lot. I hope that made sense, but I tried to describe it the best way I could. Either way, for those of you, particularly across the eastern Dakotas, look out for some of these storms going into the afternoon and evening hours, and then across probably we'll say the southern half of Minnesota going into the evening and nighttime hours. Keep an eye on these storms as they track down to the southeast. And I'll make sure and have the live feed up and going on Sunday, so be sure to tune in. And if you haven't done so already, hit the subscribe button down below so you know when I'm on live and you're able to keep track of everything as it happens on Sunday. All right, everybody, for Region Weather Live, I'm meteorologist Brad Warner, and everybody have a good day.